Hey guys, it's Robert. Why wouldn't I be? The host of Talking Bird, the special edition. I just wanted to send out a message to anybody who lives in the Bay Area that friends of the show, SF Barcast, Jeff Cleary and Andrew Lauder, are doing their first live show as part of the SF Sketchfest Festival. It's at Piano Fight Bar on 144 Taylor Street in San Francisco, California, and that's on Saturday, January 23rd, 2016, if you're listening to this in the future. And it's from 4 p.m. to 5:30 p.m. And it's free. It says all ages, but it's in a bar. So, I don't know. Call ahead. Anyway, it's a fun show. They're friends of the show, and I just wanted to show my support, and I think you should show your support. Thanks. And here's the shoe.
A long time ago, in a galaxy far, far away, a great adventure took place.
Talking Bird, a special edition.
Do you hear it? Do you hear it? Do you hear it? It's the sound. It's the sound of relief coming from Rian Johnson, wherever he is right now, realizing that he's got an extra 6 months to make episode 8. Hello, and welcome to Talking Bird, the special edition, episode 32. That is our first 2016 episode. It's 2016, right?
Yes. Is it our first episode of 2016?
It is.
When did we record the last one? I guess we recorded the last one right before the New Year.
On New Year's Eve.
That's right.
I am Robert Zachary, and you also hear in your ear John Llewellyn.
The dulcet tones. Hello, everyone.
Hello. Yes, it's been a while.
Hello.
It's been a while.
I'm in my deep register today.
You can put like a harmonizer on you.
We're gonna welcome to the new Talking Birdcast. We are now a Quiet Storm podcast.
Yeah, exactly. Quiet Storm. Well, we got some Peebo Bryson coming up next.
Oh, I love some Peebo.
Peebo.
Oh, Peebo.
Oh gosh, there is a lot. I mean, there's a lot of stuff to talk about.
Yeah,
it's been a month and 2 days since the release of The Force Awakens. And it's dropped to number 3, I think, this week.
Yeah, but it took it. I guess it had a good 4 or 5 week run at the top.
Yeah, I mean that's
maybe 3 weeks.
Yeah, I mean it's insane. It's not something that. It's funny how over the years we go back and it's like, well, when Star Wars first came out, it was in the theaters for months and months and months and months, and then when it was out, they struck new prints and put it back out. I mean, I don't think that's not the way the movie industry works anymore. So having, top of its game for better part of a month, I think, it's broken domestic, international records all over the world. And I think that even though with the even through the protestations of the participants that like we had no idea that this would happen, I think that they must have. I mean, nobody's going to know for sure, but I think if you start to hear the stories behind the creation of this film, I don't think they left much to chance. But one of the things that I think is a consequence of that is now Bob Iger or whoever makes, or Kathleen Kennedy, whoever makes these big decisions about release dates, realized, like, wow, Christmas, we had an open field.
Mm-hmm.
We didn't have to compete with ourselves. We didn't have to, a Marvel movie or whatever. So it looks like, as far as I can tell, Star Wars is now going to be a Christmas phenomenon with the announcement in the last hour that Rian Johnson's Episode 8 has been pushed to...
Episode 8?
Episode 8, man! Has been pushed to December 15th, 2017.
Yep.
So he's got an extra 6 months, which I know is that and...
Which it also sounds like he needs, honestly. I mean, right, so I think you're right. Part of it is that Disney realized they can make a ton of money if they release these in December, that they're not competing with these other summer blockbusters. They don't have to worry about, releasing this and then 2 weeks later the Harry Potter spinoff comes out or whatever else. Because I think, what does it say? The Guardians of the Galaxy 2 was going to be released in early May, right? So this would have been a case where Disney's taking money away from their Marvel franchise, essentially, to put out the Star Wars movie. And then Pirates of the Caribbean 8, or whatever it is, 5, was going to come out later in the summer.
5, yeah.
Yeah, 5. It was going to come out in July, and so now they can move that up. So, yeah, I mean, it makes sense from that perspective. It also sounds like they seriously need that time, because... these are rumors, but I'm pretty sure they're true. They're rewriting the scripts. They're reconfiguring some of their characters. They haven't even cast some characters yet. A long time ago, I think we talked about this at the time, but, there were talks that Gina Rodriguez and Gugu Mbatha-Raw and a couple of other actresses, Tatiana Maslany, were all auditioning for either one or two characters, and the word is that Rian Johnson has retooled and decided to focus more of the Episode 8 story on the existing characters that we were just introduced to in Episode 7, and take those other characters that they were going to cast, big name people, and sort of scale those roles down a little bit. Which I think makes perfect sense. I mean, we talked about this too in the lead up when we were getting all this news before Episode 7 even came out, that you had all these characters, and on the villain side, on the hero side, and I mean, you have to find space for all of them. And I think Episode 7 did a decent job of that. General Hux didn't have much to do, really, except that one scene where he just screams, but.
He cries a little bit. His eyes are wet.
Yeah, but so then if you're going to take all of those characters, and now everyone, there's all this interest in, like, well, who is Supreme Leader Snoke? Oh, and by the way, now we're throwing another villain in with Benicio del Toro.
Yeah, I hope that doesn't. I hope this
all this interest in Rey and Finn and Poe, and and now we're throwing these other two people in. Right? It seems like this was a smart move to sort of rethink that story and focus on who you've already introduced, and honestly, who we don't really know their stories that much. So there's more room to explore those in the next movie.
Yeah, I hope this doesn't affect anything with... one of the big things I was excited about was the addition of Benicio del Toro in this movie. I hope this doesn't mean that his role will be scaled back or anything.
I don't think his role will be scaled back because they've already cast him.
Right.
And especially a guy like that. I mean, you don't go and get Benicio del Toro just to give him, 3 lines.
Yeah, I watched Sicario this weekend.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a good movie. It's a kind of a action thriller thing, but he's basically the best part of it.
Right.
He plays a very mysterious type guy, which I won't get into because I don't want to spoil anything about the movie. But I mean, that's something he does. It's amazing what a chameleon that guy is with his, just the way he can, his accent in this movie. It's very bland, and but then then all of a sudden you're like, man. I don't know. I was very kind of bummed that he was underutilized in the Guardians of the Galaxy because he was actually part of the reason I was really excited about that movie, and I felt that his role never really got to pay off. So I'm kind of hoping that maybe he's not going to be like a Hux thing where he's underused and he's kind of just a standing dude and he's just a lot of sound effects around, or he's in a mask or something. Of course, then again, mask acting is a new art form.
Yeah.
According to Adam Driver. Did you see Adam Driver on SNL this week?
I did not.
It's pretty good.
I don't really watch Saturday Night Live much.
See, I kind of I'm a habitual guy at this point. They did a really funny Undercover Boss.
I read of it, but I did not watch it.
Somebody kind of compared him to maybe being kind of a Jeff Goldblum type actor, which I think is a fair assessment.
Yeah,
it's like I
could see that.
That's kind of the vibe I got off of him. I mean, I've been kind of inundated, and I know we've talked about this already before, but with this press run, I kind of find him to be honest, the most interesting of all the new cast members. That just his whole what I thought, having seen him in Girls compared to who he kind of is and what he does with him, outside of acting. It's like I'd heard he'd been in the Marines, but I didn't know he was still pretty active with like military outreach programs and stuff like that for returning vets. It's just like that tall, gangly guy. It's just like, but and even, which I think we'll probably get to, we'll talk a little. Are we going to talk a little bit about the EW interview?
Yeah, we can talk about that a little bit. So, well, let's start off. So, all right. So, episode 8 got pushed back, but of course, episode 7, people are still talking about episode 7, and particularly the effects of the movie. Now, the 2 of the visual effects folks have done some interviews, and then Entertainment Weekly just released a podcast where it was a conversation that one of their writers had with J.J. Abrams and Michael Arndt and Lawrence Kasdan about the film. And a lot of that, I mean, it focused some on the story, but there's a decent amount of that was about sort of the effects and everything too. But so was there anything in that Entertainment Weekly podcast that struck you or that you thought was really interesting?
I mean, as far as the visual effect, the video part, I thought was interesting. It always does kind of makes me realize that, the kind of the Wild West attitude that we always hear about when the stories of A New Hope was being made, like famously, Lucas came back from filming in England and saw that they were a bunch of like pot smoking dudes, shooting each other with garden hoses in the parking lot while, $1 million had been spent on maybe 15 seconds of usable effects. And like that this is kind of the beginning of him bringing down the hammer and it becoming more of a, a workman-like thing. Now it really seems, 40 years on, it's interesting. The guys, and unfortunately I didn't write their names down. We'll put this in the show.
So
notes.
Neil Scanlon was one, and the other one is. So I'm just going to make mouth noises until I remember.
Yeah. Well, anyway, it's just the idea of like, well, they were heavily involved in episode 3 at least.
Yeah, Chris Corbold, I think that's what it was.
Yeah, I think that's the name.
Yeah, and I think Neil Scanlon worked with the Jim Henson Creature Workshop for a long time as well, and so he may or may not have been involved in some of the original trilogy. I can't remember.
Yeah, I don't think there's a lot of original trilogy guys, except for maybe Dennis Muir and Ben Burt that are actually still.
But Scanlon, at least, like he had even retired from the industry, or at least had kind of stepped down his the number of projects that his company would take on, and was basically talked out of retirement to do this film.
Yeah, I think it's just like they talk a little bit about the kind of basically at the end of the interview, they concede that they don't really get into the story of the prequels. Has a lot to do with, they talk about it in terms of fan expectation,
Mm-hmm.
which, I mean, if that's indicative of where Star Wars is now in 2016, it is all about pleasing fans,
Mm-hmm.
not necessarily to above all else, but it's within those top 5 primary concerns of
Right.
when decisions are made, like how are the fans going to react to this?
Yeah.
You know, what is their capacity? What are we going to do different that people complained about? And essentially what he conceded was that Episode 3 was an animated film with live action actors inserted into it.
Mm-hmm.
And they talk about the very
Certainly looks that way.
yeah, and of course at the time when I saw it in the theater, I didn't think of that. But now on subsequent viewings and watching it on my television and being actually a lot, being able to analyze stuff, it's kind of shocking about how animated the film is. At first, I was just like trying to process the story for what it is or whatever.
Yeah.
Giving it the benefit of the doubt, not trying to be super critical about it. But now when I turn my critical eye to it, yeah, it's almost hard to watch because like a lot of motions aren't. Someone even pointed out like a shot one of my favorite scenes in the entire prequel trilogy is the opera scene, the story of Darth Plagueis, and they actually point out how they reanimate Hayden Christensen's head at a certain sequence, and you're like, oh. Well, that's going to ruin it for me forever. Whereas I didn't feel like knowing how things were done for the original detracted from that. But
Right, it's like added to it. You're like, oh, wow, that's really cool that they could just take this technology or like they just made a rubber mask and suddenly, there's like a magic to it, it's whereas, they're like, well, we didn't do a great job nailing down the continuity of where his head was angled in this shot in different takes, and so we just had to morph it from one to the other. It's like, well, that just speaks to the fact that George Lucas didn't really care about actually being a good director. He just wanted to edit stuff together to make it, he wanted to direct it in the editing room rather than on the set.
Which, I mean, to be fair, that is something that he had mentioned even in the early trilogy. That
he's pretty upfront
that
about.
He wished he could do it.
Yeah.
But I mean, one of the things that I found interesting is that these special effects guys were talking about what a difference it makes. Because obviously there was a lot of CGI. I mean, if you've seen the demo reel for the Oscar, their Oscar reel or whatever, it's kind of like, oh wow, there is a lot of CGI in this. There has to be, and that's the one thing they kept saying. Like, you wouldn't want to see a practical movie because we couldn't do the huge, crashed Star Destroyers. We couldn't do Maz Kanata's castle. We couldn't, we couldn't have
some of the camera moves they did with the Falcon and the way the Falcon moved. In the different dogfights, like you couldn't really do that practically in the same way.
Yeah, and it's the idea that you have to touch back. It's the mantra that J.J. Abrams keeps saying when people criticize the movie. It's like we had to go back to go forward, and it's like they go back, they use some of these old techniques, but then you also have to adjust for the fact that we perceive 40 years of perceiving special effects, and it has to be at a certain speed. Otherwise it'll look like, why is everything so slow?
Right.
But even down to the interaction of actors with digital characters, digital sets, which they spoke of in this interview, and how essential it was to the idea that a lot of that prequel was actors kind of, they were acting to nothing.
Right.
And I mean, I think we all knew this. This isn't really a big revelation.
Right.
But just the idea when the animators can see, boy, we don't have a lot to work with here because they, either it's a composite performance of 5 different performances of maybe a rehearsal take, a full take, a take where somebody's lightsaber hilt breaks in half in the middle of it and they just cut that part. And it becomes, it does make make a great case for the continuing importance of good acting in Star Wars movies, which George would make you think, well, I just hired really good actors. And it's like, well, you did and you didn't. You hired a lot of actors that may be really good in other things, but they didn't really have even after 3 movies. I mean, I think the only person who was ever by the end of it, seemed to get the hang of it was Ewan McGregor, who had been in all 3.
And even then, I think he would admit that the actual process of making the film was kind of tough.
Yes.
In part for those reasons, in part. And and so that's where, hearing Abrams and the effects guys talk about what was practical and what was digital, I was really interesting, and the way that they use some of the digital technology, right? So that, and this has been repeated a lot by this point, so I'm not like breaking news here, but when after Finn and Poe crash on Jakku, and Finn wanders through the desert, and he finally gets to the village where he meets Rey, right? And he's parched, he's looking for water, and so he just finds this thing of water that this huge animal is drinking out of. That animal was practical,
right?
That was there.
Is that the Hapabor, I think is it?
Yeah,
what it's called.
And so hearing them talk about what was digital, and it's like, yeah, they still use puppets, and then they just CGI, they digitally removed the puppeteers. Like, yeah, that's a really smart way to do that, I think, especially because, and even going back to the prequels and the, those webisodes, those making of things about the prequels, and about the creature effects, even for episode 2, I think, or episode 2 or 3, the creature department, they're saying, there have been real advances made in, latex and the quality of the foam and the animatronics and, how all these things are done. And again, that was, at this point, 15 years ago, if not more. And so, all of that technology and the materials are so much better now that you can still do that kind of puppetry work or animatronic work or whatever and have it look pretty good. And all you need to do is just, digitally remove the person's hand. I mean, so this is unrelated, but it reminds me of it. There was a thing a couple months ago online. There was an article about, how they make those shampoo commercials or hair coloring commercials where, you have the water like splashing someone in the face or, the hair moving in a certain way. And what it is just someone in a green suit who's actually throwing the water on the lady's face or, messing with her hair in a certain way. And then they just digitally remove the guy in the green suit.
Weird.
And so it's essentially the same idea. And yeah, I just think that's such a smart way to do it, that everything else has all of these other technologies and these other materials have become so much more sophisticated that you're not, the line in what a practical effect looks like versus a digital effect is maybe blurred a little bit, and so maybe it does make more sense to go back to some of these practical things.
Yeah, it's like the old, in my very limited art, high school art class training, it's almost like the concept of when you're trying to create a representation of a human figure, they always tell you, well, when you start out, don't get too hung up on the shape of the person. Get the negative space around them. Draw the air around them. Draw the, you know what I mean? It's like draw the not their aura, but the kind of like the
shadows of the way
shadow,
the light falls.
Yeah, the way they take over the thing, and then it starts to fill in. And it seems like that's kind of like they kind of they figured it out, the formula. It's like, and I was about ready to go off on another tangent, but we still haven't talked about the podcast part of this thing. The other thing that we're referring to as a podcast, it was Anthony Bresnikan from EW. In his own words, he has the Star Wars beat. He's the guy he did one of the first Star Wars Celebration Q&As. Mm-hmm. He's kind of a young guy. And he had this, it was Michael Arndt, J.J. Abrams, and Lawrence Kasdan, and kind of it was an audience. I don't think they didn't answer questions. Maybe from the audience. But yeah, it was kind of an interesting
thing. One of the things that I took away from it was, and it kind of actually made me, I don't know why, but it kind of made me feel good, is the idea that Michael Arndt was not, he didn't leave it in a kind of like a huff. It wasn't
right. He wasn't fired because he wasn't doing a good job.
Yeah.
Or I mean, he was essentially fired, or
yeah, he was.
They moved on to other people, but it was, they're
bring
still
him back,
keeping him around.
and they're very candid about the construction of the story.
Yeah.
And the idea that Michael Arndt was actually the guy that kind of proved it to them that you couldn't have Luke Skywalker in the film,
right?
As a, and obviously going forward,
if you're going to have Luke Skywalker in the film, then the movie is essentially going to be about Luke Skywalker, but you can't have it be about Luke Skywalker and try to introduce all these other new characters,
right? And that's the thing. It's like, and at first, it's like it's the whole thing where when all the dust settled after coming out of Episode 7, I was still kind of like, I was a little bummed. I was like, oh man, we just get 2 shots of him.
Right.
And it was privately, I was kind of like, oh man, because he's kind of my guy. He's
right.
Some people are like, oh, Han Solo or Lando. And it's like, no, like Luke's kind of my guy. I mean, that was my preferred figure of choice. That was my preferred character to follow in the story. So to have him be kind of relegated to a cameo, it was kind of disheartening. But although after we'd kind of been fed this huge meal, it's like you can't really sit back and go, I'm still hungry. So it's like one of those things where it's almost, I begrudgingly mention that. But the idea that, Arndt's observation that every version of this story, and even it's been backed up in this Art of the Force Awakens book, that because he was initially, Disney, of course, really wanted him or whoever was. I have some problems with the timeline. I don't really understand who owned it at one point when they were working on it, but that can come up later. Just the idea that, Michael Arndt was completely right. Because if I think about, if I just think about Luke coming in, in the first third of this movie, it's kind of like, yeah, all of a sudden I don't really care so much about Rey's thing. It's like, yeah, that's great. And I definitely find myself less enamored of like, what's going on with this Finn guy? Not that these guys did a bad performance, or their performance, maybe it would have been different. I don't know. But I mean, a lot of it is kind of, a lot of the story that it becomes interesting because this is who we are. This is who we are given to watch. And this is the story. And it's like, Luke becomes the, and it's they call it a mystery, but it's, one of the criticisms they think, well, the idea that like, well, Luke's not in it, but his aura, or I keep saying aura. What am I turning into, a hippie?
He's Poochie, right? When he's not on screen, everyone's standing around asking, "Where's Poochie?"
Exactly, and it's like that he's supposed to have. They go, "Oh, he's the ghost of the whole movie," which I don't agree. I mean, there's definitely some references early on, and there's and then there's really nothing till the very end. But I think that's good. I mean, I think you got to keep something in the tank for later on. I mean, there are 2 more movies coming up, and there'll be plenty of time. And I think now it's one of those things where, if we had Luke in this movie, and we had, Mark Hamill, who's 63 or whatever, and he's either doing like these physical stunts that he had to train months for, or they're CGIing it up where he's bouncing off the walls like Yoda. I think that would have stretched credibility. I mean, this way we're so enamored with Rey, we're enamored with Finn. We want to know what's going on with these people. It's not going to be like, we're not going to feel cheated when Luke shows up and maybe he does do an Alec Guinness kind of situation where he's more talk than action. He doesn't go on the journey of the next movie. Maybe he's the Yoda or whatever. He's just the voice of reason. And we won't necessarily be like, oh man, I thought he was going to be right there in the action. And to that, I mean, just the idea that this story is kind of the constant revision and them going back, and just the idea like that Larry Kasdan had said, "Come on, dummy, how about you guys are thinking too inside the box? What if one of the stormtroopers turned his back on the
Right.
And they're all
like who should there's a question of who should Finn be. I don't even think he was called Finn at that point.
Yeah, I think he was called Sam.
Yeah, right. And so was he going to be like a pirate? Was he going to be a bounty hunter, another smuggler, whatever? And Lawrence Kasdan just goes like, "What if he's a stormtrooper?"
And I mean,
I mean, it's and you're right that I think Michael Arndt played a bigger role in the final product than I think he got credit for a little while in the run up to the movie. But at the same time, listening to that conversation, I was like, God, I am really not sure that anyone besides Lawrence Kasdan knows how to write these movies. Like so many things that, that they mentioned that like he would just be there like, well, what about this? And we go like, oh, of course, that is exactly what it should be. Right. Like, and so we have all these movies coming up now where he's not going to be playing that same role. And it's like, I'm a little nervous about.
Well, I mean, he did let it slip. I think he's read the episode 8 screenplay, which to me means that, at least at the very least, Kathy Kennedy handed it to him and said, what do you think? I think
he said he knows Rian Johnson. And so Rian Johnson may have said like, hey, let me know what you think.
Yeah, one of the weird things about, and I think I've said this before, is that we talk about Rian Johnson like as if he's like some 28-year-old, Lucas guy. I mean, he's like a 41-year-old man. You know what I mean? He's not, maybe some of the themes he's worked with, like Brick and stuff, was mostly supposed to be high schoolers or whatever. I mean, guy is he's a fully formed director. He's not some greasy haired kid just off the bus in Hollywood. Right. So it's, I understand what you're saying about Kasdan though. It's like,
right. Like Rian Johnson's going to make a movie. He's going to make a science fiction movie, certainly like a sci-fi fantasy movie. The extent to which it works as a Star Wars movie though, I think kind of remains to be seen.
And that's what they say, and everyone has said it's got a dark tone to it, which people are assuming because if we're following the 3-act structure,
right?
Which at this point, why would you mess with it?
Right.
That doesn't mean you have to have "I'm your father" and hands have to go flying, but they're gonna. Even though I think there's a lot of darkness in in The Force Awakens. My only concern is that maybe that is kind of daunting for Rian Johnson's story because they kind of, it's almost like, and maybe I'm probably the wrong person to make this analogy, but maybe episode 7 was almost like somebody getting like the first draft pick of something and they get to go and they say, oh, well, I want to pick the death of a beloved character. I want to pick the super weapon. I want to the betrayal of a son to his family and his father. It's like let's all the inversions and stuff like that. And it's like, well, I mean, you could go anywhere with this, but then it also makes you feel like, ooh, did they already are they going to have to, in the interest of telling kind of a cyclical story, are they going to have to reapproach some of these archetypes of the story? And it's like, didn't we have this in the last movie? Why are we doing this again? Like, if Luke gets turned into gets X'd out or something and he comes back as a ghost and you're like, hey, this is too much like blah, blah, blah. But
I mean, one thing that I thought was interesting in that conversation that made me think about episode 8 as well is, they were talking about Kylo Ren. And, and J.J. Abrams was talking about one of the great things and one of the genius bits of episode 4 is that, George Lucas kind of drops you right essentially in the middle of a story.
Right.
And trusts the audience to sort of pick up whatever context clues they need to understand that story, in episode 4, right? It's episode 4, not episode 1. And so they were sort of doing... they kept that in mind when they're doing episode 7, and so the whole idea behind Kylo Ren is that it's not, in episode 4 you're introduced to this villain who is like fully formed, essentially, right? Darth Vader is like a fully formed villain. then in episode 1 through 3, you see like the beginning of this villain and how he became a villain and his backstory and everything. And so in episode 7, they took Kylo Ren and said, well, what is sort of the middle of that process, right? Let's take a villain who is still maybe in the middle of that transition to becoming like a full-fledged villain. Right. And what would that be like? What would the character be like then? And which I thought was kind of an interesting way to approach it. And a way, you know, I think as much as I do think that episode 7 is, again, like you took all 3 of the original trilogy movies and maybe a little bit of Indiana Jones and you kind of blend them all together and you come out with episode 7. You know, they still tweaked, you know, parts of those formulas and tweaked that structure and tweaked some of the plot points just enough that you go, okay, that is sort of an interesting spin on, right? It's not an exact recreation of episode 4, right? You're getting the similar idea, but seen like in reverse, or, you know, again, they're starting in the middle rather than at the beginning or the end. But so what does that mean for episode 8, right? So that implies then that if he's partway on his journey to becoming a villain, he still has to finish that journey and he'll become the full-fledged villain, which you think, okay, maybe that happens in episode 8, certainly. But what if Rian Johnson has other ideas? What if he doesn't view the character in the same way? And I'm sure they communicated some of this to Rian Johnson, but he also has license to do whatever he wants. And so what if he decides, okay, I'm going to take this character in a different direction, you know, something that serves the need of the story that I want to tell.
Right.
And that's where I think you might get some of that tension where, you know, Abrams and Arn and Kasdan kind of laid a certain foundation, you know, and said, okay, well, we're laying a foundation for a house that will ultimately look a certain way. And they kind of built the first floor of that house. But then, you know, Rian Johnson's in charge of building the second floor of the house, and he's like, well, I'm going to put this kind of room in over here, and yeah, I know you set the plumbing on this side of the house, but I really would like the bathroom to be over here instead, so I'm going to move the pipes a little bit. You know, that's, I think, where I think a lot of people aren't really sure what to expect.
Yeah, I think I know what you're saying, but I think at the end it's kind of like Disney's kind of the bank, and they're gonna be like, we're not gonna pay any more for this house if you're going. But I think you mean it on kind of a micro scale.
Yeah,
yeah,
right. The broad contours, right? It's still going to be a Star Wars movie in the sense that, you know, even if it is dark, it's not like it's going to be a rated R, right? And it's not going to be completely scary. It's going to be dark in the context of what a Star Wars movie is, but you know, the things that he does with certain characters may not necessarily have been what the folks who wrote episode 7 had in mind, the future of these characters. Yeah, but that's right. But again, they signed up for this project knowing full well that they weren't going to be the ultimate arbiters of how these characters ended up. Exactly.
And I think that the attitude I got from Abrams and especially Kasdan is when it was all said and done, aside from a couple conversations they had with Rian Johnson, that they left it all on the field, so to speak, because it was just like, you know, like, well, we can worry about that, or we can just have it now, and you know, tomorrow's there's no guarantee of tomorrow, so let's just, if we have an idea that we really think will work, let's just do it now. And then we can figure it out later. And I think that even Kasdan was like, I'm really interested to see what he's going to do, because we basically, you know, used up all that. You know, you were mentioning Kylo Ren, and it just brought to mind because we do get letters or little emails from listeners, and I just wanted to, since Kylo Ren had been brought up, a listener named David. I think he's got an E on the end here, but I'm just going to say it's David, and we'll just leave it at first names here. He had sent us a DM on Twitter, and he had 3 things, two more serious than one. But the first one, it was just a quick thing, which, since we're talking script, that opening line from Lor Santeca. This will begin to make things right, which I don't know if we discussed this. So, you know, his question wasn't the opening line a clear slap to Lucas, and his second
Oh.
comment was, "Isn't Kylo Ren emo and therefore not scary at all?" And I mean, I think there was he's inserted some levity into this. So, but I mean, he's asking a serious question.
Yeah, and I think other people have asked that same question about that first line, like, "This will begin to make things right." I personally don't think that that's a direct dig at Lucas. I think the people writing this movie, while they may be aware of fan expectations and everything, they are on good enough terms with Lucas that, they're not going to consciously...
I mean those white slavers?
Yeah, right, exactly, right. And no, I mean, I'll touch on this later, but I think... that was a line designed to give that character some backstory that without revealing everything, right? And J.J. Abrams talks about this constantly, how, in episode 4, you have all of these lines that reference things, right? The Dark Times, the Clone Wars, it was a Jedi Knight just like your father, all of this stuff that then is never explained.
Right.
And so I think this is something similar that they're doing with this character, knowing that this is all you see of this character. Let's give him some lines that imply this larger backstory, this larger history, both to him and to the state of the galaxy at this point in time, that then will then be filled in later. So that's all I think that's all that was.
And that's the thing. It's like, you can't, I think they wouldn't do something like that as literally the first line if they wanted to. And I don't think, and honestly, like I said, J.J. Abrams, even though he's only one part of a very large crew of people making this movie, he said he would never do anything to disrespect George's prequels. And also, if you think about it, so they go, "This will begin to make things right." And I think the next line is, or within another line, Max von Sydow's character says something like, "Without the Jedi, there can be no balance to the Force."
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, that's a total prequel concept, that there's a balance, and that, that things, like, you actually kind of need both sides. And it's like, to me, that's, it's all this dogmatic kind of gobbledygook in a good way, that the kind of little things here and there that I kind of liked about the prequels, the idea that there was a greater mythos and stuff. So I honestly don't feel like it was a slap. I mean, I understand why people think it was a slap, because then...
Yeah. But I think there's a little bit of people kind of want that to be true.
Right.
And so they're just reading too much into it.
Yeah, I think people kind of would love to find out, like, oh, we're not going to, I think a lot of people, there's a lot of hurt feelings over those movies. I think people took it kind of personally. Yeah. And as far as the thing about Kylo Ren and being emo, I mean, I understand where you're coming from with that. I didn't get an emo vibe off. I mean, hey, I could sit there and argue that, like, I could make a convincing argument that, yes, Kylo Ren is basically the Lawrence Kasdan's anxiety about dealing with millennials. And, the idea that even a guy even my age at 42, that, like, yeah, I kind of find young people slightly terrifying, in some realms. Like, I'll be sitting there reading about something and be like, oh my God, they're going to come and, and that's the irrational, the fearful part of our brains, where we fear youth and we fear change. I mean, that's the thing. It's like, he is Kylo Ren is had to be a 21st century villain. I mean, you can't just go this binary black and white idea of good and bad that Star Wars kind of proliferated in A New Hope, but then they quickly walked it back. The idea that you leave the second movie realizing that the hero is the son of the villain, and this kind of concept that, your best friend can betray you, but then turn around and save your friends. And this idea that, morality is not just a either or kind of situation. And I think that's a lot what they're trying to impress with the Kylo Ren, is that he is, and he speaks to this as, I'm torn, there's a conflict inside of him.
Right. I know what I have to do, but I'm not sure I have the strength to do it.
And to me, it's like, it's a great description of that he is torn, that, yeah, even though he wants to be his grandfather's grandson and be like, I want to be Darth Vader, I want to be the bad guy. When he becomes enraged, when things don't go, what does he do? What's he take? He takes it out on the computer. He doesn't rip somebody's head off.
Right. He doesn't kill the guy who told him the news.
Yeah. In some ways, you know, he's a product. He's more evolved. Whereas Anakin might have been, you know, he's the guy. He just, you know, that's the big thing. Every comic book, every little, you know, thing, he's killing people left and right, which is, you know, kind of ridiculous. But, you know, yeah, there's little hints, like the idea that, you know, he does it twice. And in the second one, there's a comedic moment where the two stormtroopers are like, Kylo Ren's on his,
well, just,
he's having a bitch fit.
We'll come back later.
So I understand where that idea comes from. I honestly don't think that Kylo Ren is a commentary on millennials. I don't know, you know, there's a parody Twitter account like Emo Kylo Ren, and you know, and it's good fun, and it's perfectly it's a fair criticism in a way, but I think that is mainly, you know, we have baggage. You always have even though his hair is so much more beautiful in any other role he's ever been in, we do get some baggage to the idea that, you know, this is Adam Driver. This is the crazy boyfriend from Girls, you know, which I'm only up to season 2. So I don't know if he changed.
So I think a mutual acquaintance of ours who's a comedian, said something on Twitter right after he saw the movie, like, oh, the good thing about, or the thing about Adam Driver being, in Star Wars is that now he's the universe's problem boyfriend. Yeah. You know, it's sort of that same idea that people are still like, yeah, you're Adam Driver from Girls, but now you just have a lightsaber and are kind of sad all the time.
Yeah, I mean, and that's the thing we had touched on about my thinking the biggest contribution to Star Wars now from Disney has been that they gave it emotion.
Yeah.
And emotion is not emotions are weird things because they transcend logic. Mm-hmm. And one of the problems, you know, about the way they depicted Anakin's his internal conflict of his duty to the Jedi Order and protecting this woman that he was in love with versus his visions of wanting to save his mother, you know, versus, you know, not wanting to kill anybody, but wanting to have vengeance. So, I mean, these are all concepts that have come up before. I just feel like maybe in the past, they were never executed in a satisfactory manner because we all know Lucas doesn't know how to, you know, deal with actors. So,
so first I don't know why I didn't give that guy credit. So that's Paul J is the name of that movie. I don't know why I decided to keep him anonymous when he should get credit for that good line. But yeah, certainly in leading up to it, to the release of episode 7 and hearing about Adam Driver's like process for, you know, and J.J. Abrams go like, oh, he was so intense. He would just scream all the time before a take and to get into character. It's like, I guess. But so it'll be interesting now that he's working with different directors. Like you said, George Lucas wasn't really interested in working with actors. And so, he'll essentially be working with, I assume, 3 different directors, assuming he makes it all the way through. And so seeing how each of them approaches working with actors versus getting the visual stuff right, is going to be interesting to see. Rian Johnson has a reputation as a good director, right? And
yeah,
I don't think I haven't heard anything about how he's terrible working with actors, but he also, right? He's used to working with Joseph Gordon-Levitt all the time.
Hey, he got a decent performance out of Bruce Willis, which in this day and age
is kind of hit and miss. So yeah,
it's almost impossible at this point.
Yeah. So whatever he did to get Bruce Willis motivated to be present,
exactly.
So that's commendable. But yeah, we don't really have a lot of evidence of Rian Johnson, working with actors who are Joseph Gordon-Levitt or I guess with Brick, you could say, getting actors to deliver those lines and that script in a particular way, like that probably took some doing. And so getting, the performances in Brick was probably an accomplishment.
Yeah, I mean, the thing
and then you have Colin Trevorrow, right? Which, I mean, certainly the performances were not the thing that people liked about Jurassic World. So we'll see how that goes.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, if you really want to kind of... The thing that heartens me is I go back and I think, he did Safety Not Guaranteed, which was an incredibly small movie. And and maybe I'm biased because, like, one of the scenes was filmed like a mile from my house, and another one was filmed in my home, not far from my hometown, at a place that I grew up. So I was kind of like very involved in this story. But I mean, I think he's got, I kind of pick on him a lot because I really didn't like Jurassic World, but he's that's a gauntlet. I mean, that's a machine that you cannot all of a sudden stop this and go, we really need some real emotion here. And it's like, no, we don't. We need another dinosaur to rip another dinosaur in half. And we
need you to run from that side of the stage to that side of the stage because that's where the Ichthyosaurus is, right? Like,
exactly. And it's, I have to back off on picking on Colin Trevorrow because I feel like I'd be eating some crow, especially because I have nothing but interest in this movie being good. I have no I'm not going to take any glee out of any of these movies being bad. If anything, that it's kind of this anxiety when I. Yeah. And have you seen this thing, and I'm kind of getting a little off topic about this, like I think it's a Move On or some petition.
Oh, the petition
to bring George Lucas back.
Yeah. It's awful. It's an awful idea.
Ridiculous. Hey,
I mean, not least of which because they're like, well, he needs to finish the saga. Well, how do you know that 9 is going to be the last one?
It's not going to be.
And B, he's going to be like 80.
Well, he's also not going to be interested in doing the movie that they want to do.
Yeah. No, not at all.
I'm just going to, let's just pretend that 7 and 8 didn't happen.
Yeah, guess what? That petition was not going to go anywhere the minute that he sold it to Disney.
I mean, I watched the whole Charlie Rose interview, and yes, there was a lot of heat about him, making a comment, which if you really think about it, that was just maybe it was definitely a poor choice of words considering, the climate about people are very sensitive about, when you use colloquial or you use phrases and he's not really, I don't want to get into it, but I think we all know what line he crossed, but I don't think it was like a line of, oh, he can never get back. He's completely ruined my idea of him. I think he's a guy who basically, and I think we talked about this on the last show, is that, I'd hate to be confronted with the thing like, well, you could either do this one thing for the rest of your, probably statistically, your life, or you could, give it to someone else and let them do it, and you can still enjoy, do the other things you want to do. Because obviously doing Star Wars was not his whole life because, he did take a break for all that time. And a lot of indicators in books I've read is that the prequels were not wholeheartedly the idea that he was up late at night going, I need to tell the rest of the story.
Right.
And there was a financial gain for him. That was part of the idea. Like, I haven't made a movie in 15 years. Right. I need to get something
I need
done.
to make sure that ILM keeps getting work in the future, which means they need to be at the forefront of this technology.
He stepped away from storytelling and became a technician. It's hard to get back into that mindset. But yeah, the idea that somehow, it happens. The movie comes out and everybody's all excited. And then you start to hear these little criticisms. And we can, there's tons of stuff you can criticize about these movies, but some of it just seems, kind of angry and mean-spirited and kind of, and it's unrealistic to think that even if the movie did terrible, that somehow that would be an impetus in order to bring, Lucas back into it. The number one thing I've heard is like, well, Star Wars is fan fiction now. It is.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it is. Anything eventually has to be, when it breaks off from its creator, it becomes, fan fiction, for the lack of a better term.
I mean, and honestly, when you read that book, how Star Wars conquered the universe, right? It's Star Wars itself was a kind of fan fiction to begin with, and so
exactly.
It's, then it becomes fan fiction twice removed or whatever.
It's a love letter to Joseph Campbell. It's a love letter to Kurosawa.
Flash Gordon.
Yeah, Kurosawa and that kind of idea. It's like, what if I took all these elements and I mishmashed them together? I mean, I don't think he's happy about it, but he could have a far worse. He could be in the scenario like, say, that Marvel has with some of their properties being owned by Fox and Sony. Mm-hmm. And look what the terrible custodians they've been of Spider-Man and the Fantastic Four, and some of the properties of the some of the X-Men things that just like some of those that first Wolverine movie, and it's like just the tone deaf way that they deal with their properties, that they don't really understand it. At least, at the very least, you can say, I think that the Disney and Kathy Kennedy or whatever, I think they understand what makes Star Wars work. Now, that's not to say that they may not make mistakes. They might, overdo it. They might miss out on some of the things that made those first three movies special, but I don't think they do it on purpose. I don't think somebody would, they'd know full well, oh, we're so off the reservation about this. And then they just go, let's just do it anyway. But, it's, everything is a product of its time. And I don't know if we, I was thinking about the, well, that's a soundtrack thing. I don't want to get off into that.
Yeah. Well, yeah. So we could talk about the soundtrack a little bit. I got the book, The Art of the Force Awakens, that I can talk about a little bit. But before we get to either of those, I wanted to ask you about Rogue One a little bit, because and tie this back to the conversation we were having earlier about the effects in Episode 7, because, well, I should say to the listeners that off the air over our emails, you, Robert, had expressed some concern that you were worried that that Rogue One wasn't going to get sort of the financial support that Episode 7, that they weren't going to pump as much money into this one. I don't know the extent to which that's true, but it does sound like a lot of the visual effects folks rolled right into Rogue One off of Episode 7. Including the Neil Scanlon and Chris Coswald. But that also, Gareth Edwards has recently talked about how he views sort of the aliens and by extension the effects of Rogue One, where he sort of talked about. He talked about Episode 7 and the aliens we saw in Episode 7 as being more like the cantina scene from A New Hope. And I guess, certainly in Maz Kanata's castle, that's true. I don't know the extent to which he meant the aliens like on Jakku and everything. But, he said where, you're just kind of shown these aliens briefly. And it's more like, hey, look at that. Now let's get back to the story with Daisy Ridley. Whereas Gareth Edwards is saying, the aliens of Rogue One are going to play a more critical role, and they're going to be interacting with the human actors, the actors who aren't in suits, and so they're going to move more realistically. They're going to emote more than maybe the characters that they did for The Force Awakens. So this is Neil Scanlon talking, and he says they're a closer part of the storytelling. They're less of the world, and they're more of this group who have a mission and play a part in that. So it seems like they're trying to set up this thing where, well, in Episode 7, we had all these fun practical aliens, but they were just kind of there to look at and be like, oh, neat, that's a cool thing. Whereas in Rogue One, they're going to be more integrated into the story and integrated into the actual group of protagonists. Which, I mean, again, you can do that cheaply, I guess, but it does sound like they, if you're going to put them as more of the group of your protagonists, that means they have to look good, and that interaction has to look real. Going back to what we were saying earlier. And so, I don't know. Does that help assuage your fears a little bit, or are you still worried that Rogue One it's going to be the Star Wars movie that they make on the cheap?
I get this feeling, and also there's a story out right now that broke a couple days ago about how they're going to go through reshoots and rewrites.
Yep. Yeah, right.
Which, all these movies do that. It's just, but that's also a good, a big way to that's a big red flag in my mind. I mean,
yeah.
One of the I can't remember if I brought this up already, but I always buy all the Hobbit movies, even though I didn't go see them all, just to watch. And then I also buy the extended ones because I like the extras. Mm-hmm. And one of the big selling points of this Battle of the Five Armies, the third, the tedious, the most boring of all the Hobbit movies, the one that's you're just at the end, you're just like, is this over? When is this ending? There's the extras where basically Peter Jackson concedes that the reason that there's a third movie is because they couldn't figure out how to end the second movie. And it's just so they created an entire movie from, not from whole cloth, but just this from the stems and the leftovers of the scripts.
Mm-hmm.
And they literally had to let's just make it longer. And it just seems like such an odd way of doing it. And it makes me, when you start to hear this thing has to be out by, this January. So it has to be out in 11 months.
Mm-hmm.
And they say that it was shooting while Force Awakens was getting finished with its post-production. It's just something about it just makes me, and the fact that Gareth Edwards is known for kind of being able to get pretty good production value on the cheap. If you ever have watched his, I think it was his first film, the Monsters one with Scoot McNairy and it's all set in South America, and the aliens it's about an alien invasion, kind of very organic alien invasion of South America, where people live in a world where basically these huge beasts live in the forests and stuff like that. And so he was very able to, for very little money, was able to get very convincing, large scale looking creatures. Yeah. And I think that was why why he was a shoo-in for Godzilla. The problem is it just makes me think that the way that they're advertising these movies, the scope of the story, the thing that there's no way that, I mean, they essentially say that the production costs minus promotions for Force Awakens was $200 million. I mean, that's a crazy amount of money because they needed a win. They needed a slam dunk on this movie, because if they'd come out and they cheaped on any of it, people would just be like, oh, it's prequels all over again. Fuck this thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I almost wonder if it's that these anthology movies, we're taking chances. They're already kind of padding us to be don't think you're going to be walking into this ain't your dad's Star Wars movie.
Yeah.
And I mean, I don't know. It just seems like there's going to be a lot more set extensions, kind of almost like prequel era set extensions, a lot more heavy CGI. And it might actually be a kind of, and I could be completely wrong. I'm no special effects expert, but it just feels like those are the kind of things that they do to save money. I mean, I remember when there was they tried to reboot, the Ronald D. Moore version of Battlestar Galactica was quite successful. And, they did a more of a cheaper version of less technology or whatever. Probably they tried to save some money. They did this thing called Caprica. It was more of a talkie kind of show. And it got canceled after a season. So what they tried to do is they said, well, we missed out on the action. So let's do something with a lot of action. So they did this, I think it was supposed to be a pilot. I forget the name of it. It was Blood and Chrome. That's it. And it was going to be the early days. And they did, and I watched the behind the scenes of it. And so much of it was basically actors acting in front of green garbage bags taped on cardboard boxes.
Mm-hmm.
Like, literally, the entire set was a complete construct. I mean,
yeah,
even beyond what we've seen in the prequels. I mean, because people grouse about it, but there were physical sets in large parts. They weren't on the scale of any other Star Wars movie, but they were there. But this thing was almost a complete, like, literally, like, hey, let's just go stand on this sheet and act it out, and we'll put everything in later. And I really hope that that's not the kind of way that they're going to kind of try to stretch their special effect dollar.
Yeah,
because I guess it's just this. All my anxiety stems from watching, just hearing how involved this movie was, the Force Awakens was, to make, and then they're going to really churn another one out in a year. Yeah. I mean, obviously the production started early, but I honestly, there's just part of me that just goes, they have to go back and remanufacture stuff from Stormtroopers from the original trilogy, and how many of those are they going to want to make? Whereas, if they make a First Order Stormtrooper, now I don't know how durable these things are, if they're actually going to be reusing them. When I found out that there's actually like a 3D printer on set to make C-3PO's parts, which I will say this, somebody had said that, I listened to, like one of these roundtable discussions on Rebel Force Radio. And although I kind of disagreed with a lot of this guy's, I think his name's Kyle Newman. I think he's one of the guys that did that Fanboys movie. He's a director. He's one of the host's friends, and they have him on. He was very candid about what he liked and didn't like about the movie. And one of the things that I totally agreed with him is that C-3PO looked cheaper than shit.
Yeah.
There was something so cheap about that costume. And to me, that almost kind of like goes like, well, okay, so they're cutting corners here. And like, if they're going to like, well, how many Stormtrooper uniforms do we absolutely need for this? How many can we digitally recreate? And then it becomes like the prequels, where there was never a clone trooper uniform ever made. There's nothing to, basically the 501st are the only people that ever made physical clone trooper costumes. And it shows. So, this idea that, hey, I'm coming in, we're spending a lot of time with these CGI aliens that you're just going to love, and, blah, 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 and this is, like, we're going to make this dirty and gritty. It's like, well, we already had George telling us in 1998, like, one of the characters is going to be completely CGI, and you're just going to love them. And we got Jar Jar Binks, which I'm not going to pick on Jar Jar Binks too much anymore, because did you see the Amit Best interview?
No,
around?
I read the headline that I didn't actually watch it.
I got nothing.
I'm not that interested.
I'll be honest. After watching, I got nothing but love for Amit Best, because I really feel bad for the guy, because he was a pioneer in something that didn't exist at the time. Now, okay, he picked the voice, and George approved it, and it wasn't the greatest voice, but he's in the interview, one of the biggest things he puts the two things I took away from is, one, this is before Gollum, this is before Dobby, the house elf on Harry Potter, and he wasn't beating his chest saying like, you need to respect me, but it was more of like, hey, I didn't have anything to work with. I didn't, everybody else that does motion capture now, when, the off chance that it isn't actually Andy Serkis doing it, now this motion capture suit and stuff like that, which, he was wearing a suit, and then they would shoot the plates, and then he would stand off the set. Now they put them in the blue underwear with the dots, and they use the same thing in video games, and they probably use it in those shampoo commercials. But, just the kind of idea that, and they even asked him like, well, if you got asked to come back and do something, would you? Like, no, I think I'm pretty much done with Star Wars. Just that kind of sad reservation. And getting back into what I'm talking about, Rogue One, it's just, they went into production and with obviously a story that didn't work, which makes me really nervous.
Right.
I mean, basically, long and short of it, I feel like everything I've heard about Rogue One makes me think of the problems that I had with the prequels. And, and just the idea, it's exciting that Lawrence Kasdan and his son are working on this Han Solo movie, but they're already kind of like, they put out the list of cast people, and I'm just not excited, and I can't remember them all, but
the prospective Han Soli.
Yeah, the Han
Soli.
The Hans, I guess, is what they were.
The
called.
Hans Solo.
Means people have brought
the
up,
only name I remember is Dave Franco, and I am perfectly fine with Dave Franco not playing.
Yeah, I was going to say, and I'm not. And like, who's the guy? Oh God, who's the guy? Who's the Whiplash kid?
I don't know. I didn't.
Oh jeez, he played Reed Richards in this new Fantastic Four that flopped as well, and he's in those Insurgent, Divergence.
Oh,
movies.
Divergence.
Yeah, all those movies, and every time I see him, I'm just like, ugh. He kind of looks like Danny Kaye. And that's like, it's like, he doesn't look, I know, and that's a weird, Danny Kaye. I'm thinking, I was like, it's like Gene Kelly, Danny Kaye. No, it's Danny Kaye. He has this face like Danny Kaye, and he looks like, it's like, he doesn't look anything like Harrison Ford. And, you don't have to do the Brandon Routh thing where basically they cast, Brandon Routh got that Superman gig because he kind of looks like, Chris Reeve, but not really. You don't have to do it that way. I can go a certain distance. I don't know. I'm already kind of hearing people go, I'd much, after Harrison Ford, when they thought he was all excited to be coming back, and nobody really picked up on the fact that, well, it's because they're killing him off. But
right
now that Han Solo is no longer an active participant in this story, people have actually kind of said, I don't actually need this movie. And that's another weird thing where people are like going, nah, I think I've had enough of that guy. And they're like, whoa, I don't know if I agree with
and
that.
Especially like, then we're getting another Indiana Jones movie, and it's like, yeah, you know what? Let's maybe find a different kind of story to tell.
Yeah.
Because I can just imagine a young Han Solo movie being essentially Indiana Jones in space, right? Where, that's fun, but I'm ready for Star Wars to tell their stories. Now, again, Lawrence Kasdan's working on it. I'm sure it'll be well written. Like it'll work as a movie. But yeah,
Yeah, the guys that are doing it.
You want to do something else? That's good with me.
I'd only known that they had done, at the time when I'd heard about it, I'd only known that they had done the Jump Street movies, which, like I said, I like the first one, and the second one actually does it. Like I said, it does a weird, almost like you double check if you were eating the right brownie for dessert kind of thing at the middle, where you're like, whoa, this movie got really weird, like in a kind of Friday night midnight movie kind of way.
Mm-hmm.
So they have this, and they do Last Man on Earth, which is like is a show that I started out loving, and then going, I don't know if I love this, to having it come back in the second season and saying, I really like this. This is telling an interesting story. So these are obviously competent guys. I haven't really heard anything, and obviously probably very early for them to start talking about what their vision. I don't know if Lawrence Kasdan or whoever's talking about this knows what it does to fans when you say, oh yeah, this is almost slapstick, going to be a slapstick kind of movie. And you're like, what?
Yeah.
It brings like, kind of like, well, there are some great slapstick stuff in Star Wars movies, but there's also a lot of slapstick in the prequels that are just like a mess. So, I would almost, you've always kind of, Rogue One has always been your point of anxiety.
Yeah, mostly because that's the first movie we're getting after Episode 7. And right, so again, Lawrence Kasdan's not working on it. John Williams isn't working on it. And it is a film where they're just kind of going back over old territory. Where I'm like, I'm a little nervous about it.
Yeah, and there's already rumors that that James Earl Jones is going to come back as a voice, and
yeah, that's.
I mean, I don't know.
As long as he's alive and is healthy and able to do it, I don't know why they would get anyone else.
Exactly.
To be honest,
yeah, because it's one of those things where when you hear him do it, it's something special. Nobody can do that impression right. I was at Target, and have you seen these things they call Battle Buddies?
No.
They're 4-foot tall plastic Star Wars toys.
Okay.
And they come there's a Darth Vader and there's a First Order Stormtrooper, and they're $100 or whatever. I mean, and you push a button and it talks. Well, whoever they got to do Darth Vader, it's just like the worst. It's like somebody just cupping their hands over their mouth into a microphone, and just like, it's like, whoa! It's like, that is ridiculous. I mean,
like, it's basically everyone did a Darth Vader impression when they were like 8 or 10,
exactly,
and then just kept doing the same Darth Vader impression for the rest of their lives. And that's what you get if you go with someone other than James Earl Jones.
Yeah, I know, and that's the thing. It's like all the old LucasArts games when they would have, they just have somebody talk really deep. And it was like, it doesn't quite work. The only person who I enjoyed their Darth Vader is on the original radio dramas, which is the late Brock Peters, who did Darth Vader. But he did a much more animated Vader.
Right. I mean, it was probably closer to the New Hope Darth Vader, who's right. His voice was not high, but like it was maybe pitched a little higher, and it was more energetic. The lines were delivered a little quicker.
Yeah. You guys will know Brock Peters, of course, because you guys are all Star Trek fans.
You all know Brock Peters.
You'll know Brock Peters. He played Benjamin Sisko's dad on Deep Space Nine. Come on, nerds. I'm sorry. It's like, I love those radio dramas, but they also don't really quite fit with Star Wars is now. There's a very extended torture scene where he's torturing Princess Leia.
I mean, they didn't really fit what Star Wars was like. Either.
I'm a member of your Rebel Alliance. No. It was like, I remember like listening to that one time and having some, because the Anne Sachs who plays Princess Leia is like literally screaming bloody murder in this.
Yeah.
And I was listening to it on a stereo, and somebody came up like, "Are you okay up there?" Like, "I'm sorry, I'm just listening to a radio drama. I need to get some headphones."
Yeah.
Anyway,
thinking about the production of Rogue One, I mean, I think a lot of folks rolled it. So I'm bringing this up to transition to the next thing, but so like I said, I got the Art of the Force Awakens book, which includes not only artwork but also a little bit of background on. It's broken into sections, so the concept stage, pre-production, production, and post-production. And so the beginning of each section, it'll say, sort of what was happening in this time period. And so, there was a point a couple of years ago, even that, or maybe just a year ago. I guess probably 2 years ago, since it's now 2016, that, a lot of the concept artists and some of the other folks who did the visual stuff, moved off of The Force Awakens onto Rogue One. Once production was pretty much set, they knew they had everything that they needed. Then folks they rolled right onto Rogue One. So they've been in pre-production and concept stuff for a little while. But you're right. I mean, and I don't know how many of those folks are also working on Episode 8, because 8 and at least the concept and pre-production artwork stage. I mean, I think Rogue One and Episode 8 probably overlapped a little bit.
Yes.
So I don't know if they have two different crews working on those or what, but I assume then the Rogue One folks will then roll on to either Episode 9 or the Han Solo movie or, something else. And so this idea of just having, a rolling art department that is still working on Star Wars, but just on different projects in Star Wars, is a little different. I mean, I guess they had that for the prequels a little bit. But this is even, multiple different projects taking place at different points in the Star Wars timeline. So that's kind of an interesting idea too. So So I won't take up too much time because I don't think you have read it or looked at it.
I have the book right here. I haven't.
Oh, you do?
I haven't read it, but I've flipped through it because yeah.
So one of the things I thought was neat is that you really do get a sense of what a collaborative effort these Star Wars films are, and that was even true when it was a George Lucas production, but
they would downplay it.
Yeah. Yeah, you would see it in the documentaries in the making of, but in the story, when the official version of how these things was like, it all sprung from the mind of George Lucas. But on Episode 7, one thing that was different was previously, when Lucas was in charge, there would basically be one art department that was in charge of designs for the creatures and the costumes and the vehicles and the buildings and everything. Whereas for Episode 7, I think they started off with one, but then they kind of split them off into three so that, there were specific design teams for the production art. So like vehicles, buildings, whatever, for creature effects, and then for the costumes. All three of those had their specific design teams, which I think is sort of interesting and is probably a more effective use of resources. But even having that division, the whole idea for what Star Killer Base is and how it works in terms of what, this thing that takes its energy from a nearby star and uses that, that came from, that was Dennis Muren's idea. Right, Dennis Muren said that at a meeting once. He was like, "Well, what if it takes its energy from a nearby star, and that's so that it's literally making the galaxy around it is making it darker, and as sort of like a visual or a physical or a real manifestation of the growth of the dark side or whatever." And then she was called Kira at the time, but Rey's speeder. The final design for that speeder came from the creature department. It didn't come from the production.
Weird.
Yeah, and so just they don't like highlight it, but you do get the sense that it really is a collaborative effort. I would say that especially earlier on in all the concept stuff, a lot of the early character designs I don't think didn't really work. And it's pretty clear why they weren't included in the movie or why they weren't approved. And I got a sense that this was a little true of the prequels as well. And so I don't know if this is a function of who is in charge of the art department for both of those things or just the state of, science fiction art departments post 1990. But, a lot of the early character designs for aliens and droids and things, they tended to be a little too insectoid or too reminiscent of either Alien or Predator.
Right.
And didn't really fit in kind of the Star Wars aesthetic. On the other hand, some of the really early concepts for vehicles and buildings I thought were really cool. And I kind of wish that they had been included in Episode 7 because they still reflected the original designs, but they were different enough, So like the new quote new TIE fighters, right? It's just basically they made the wings black and they put a red stripe on them, but it's essentially the same TIE fighter, in the film that was made. But one of the early concept drawings was with triangular wings, not in the sense that like the TIE Interceptor has kind of angled and triangular wings, but these were like actual triangles of wings. And that I thought was a really cool shape. Or there was one point where the art department was like, all right, so I guess before they figured out to just crash the TIE fighter into the planet, it's like, all right, so Finn and Poe steal this TIE fighter. How do they land it? Well, what if the TIE fighter wings like fold in half? And that's how they land, right? Like those are kind of neat ideas that still build on the original concepts, but they're different enough that you go like, oh, that's kind of neat. Or the Star Destroyer in Episode 7, I think it's just like a big Star Destroyer with just a long thing coming out of the front, sort of like like a pirate ship, where it has the long whatever coming out of the front.
Right.
But, some of the concepts that recurred a little bit for the Star Destroyer in this art book is you basically cut it down the middle lengthwise, and then you separate it but then in the middle is where you put the hangar and stuff, so that it almost looks like the front of the Millennium Falcon, right, where you have the two mandibles. Right. I don't know what you would call those, but like just make that the Star Destroyer look kind of like that. And that was a neat idea too, I thought. So I won't go through everything again, but you do see some interesting things where some designs show up in one place. So like the Guavian Death Gang, that mask was originally designed for Kylo Ren, or he was called the Jedi Killer at that point in production. So that, and that was something like the artist hit on that and was like, yeah, this is really cool. I want to make sure this gets in the movie. Okay, even if I don't use it for this character, I'll suggest it for this other thing and make sure it gets in. There's the shot of the ties that are silhouetted against the sun that's in the movie. That came from a painting Doug Chang did in like May of 2013. And that was meant to be a riff on a similar shot in Apocalypse Now. So that was kind of neat to see, like, oh yeah, that thing's been around for a while, and like, okay, that visual that needs to be in the movie, even if it, we have to sort of build the rest of the scene around that shot, and which is not all that different from what Lucas would do on some level. And so, sort of keeping with that. But Chang also did a similar painting not long after that's in the book of, it's basically the same shot except there's an eclipse behind it rather than like a full sun, and that eclipse shot is so good. It looks really neat, and the TIE fighters have these headlamps on to help them see in the dark. It's a really cool shot.
What page do you have that page marked?
I don't have the page number.
I'll be back through it. I'm just every time I have to kind of put the book down, because every time I start looking at it, I start getting like, I start going off in the
I mean, it's also interesting too to see it and look at sort of how different the work is done by art departments now. That a lot of it's digital and things. So a lot of the big paintings, if you compare them to like the Ralph McQuarrie paintings are like hand painted, whereas these are mostly done digital. But what it's interesting is, even you would think with digital stuff you could get even more precise and detailed, but a lot of these paintings are they're more atmospheric, right? They're blurrier, they're hazier.
Right.
It's sort of meant to evoke like a feeling of a certain place, which the Ralph McQuarrie paintings did too. And here I'm thinking of one with like an early version of Chewbacca that ended up becoming a design similar to what they did for Zeb in Rebels, where, they're at the cantina and he's got like his hand on his blaster and his tail, So you get both a sense of that atmosphere and that place, but then you're like, oh, look at this cool character design, and look at that cool character. Whereas a lot of the artwork that's showcased in this book, you sort of get one or the other. Right. It's either just like a standalone, hey, here's a sketch of a character, or hey, here's this kind of like hazy, dark painting of a bar, but you don't really get any detail of the characters that are in the bar because we don't want to like commit to that, or maybe we don't even have the time to spend on those. Another technique that I think got used a lot is they would take existing photos and, upload them in the computer and then digitally replace some of the stuff in the photos with a Star Wars thing. So, one is the First Order, the Starkiller base. Of course, there's this kind of iconic Nazi imagery associated with it, in part, because that they drew on that specifically. One of the artists, basically uploaded a photo of, some big Nazi gathering and just replaced all of the people standing in rows, all the soldiers standing in a row, replaced them with TIE fighters, and then just put the Imperial insignia on the hanging things, and that was it. You go like, all right, okay. That doesn't seem like it takes that long to do, but all right. Or there's another one of a junkyard from Somalia that, and you still see, they didn't remove like the Somali person walking through the shot. But it's just a photo of a junkyard in Somalia, but they digitally removed a lot of the junk and replaced it with wrecked TIE fighters, but specifically like the middle round part. And so they just have all of the, I guess from the EU, books, sometimes they were called eyeballs. And so that like eyeball part of the TIE fighter just stacked all in these piles up around each other. And I kind of wish something like that had been, on Jakku or something, because it evoked this, a lot of the images you saw of Cambodia and the massacres in Cambodia and all these skulls, which, is kind of a grim image. But, if you replace it with these technological things, these ships, it softens a little bit, but then it gives you another sense of this scale of, the destruction of this planet and the fact that you're on this kind of junk planet. So I kind of wish that had been put in there, because that's a really neat image. So I don't want to spend too much time, because like you said, you haven't looked through it, and I could say like, oh, this is a cool drawing and that's a cool drawing.
Yeah,
I mean, you still don't see everything. You don't get a lot on kind of the evolution of Kylo Ren's lightsaber. Like, you see a bunch of drawings where he's just using a normal lightsaber, and then suddenly there's one where I'm not even sure that you see one where he has like the cross guard in it, except for the cover art. And so, of course there's going to be the making of the Force Awakens book that's coming out, I think, towards the end of this year. And so I'm curious to see like how much of that book spends on kind of the art and the concept design and everything, or how much of it is just going to be, on May 5th, John Boyega came to the studio to sign his contract.
Yeah.
Pre-production started. And then on May 6th, this thing, So I guess they didn't want to step on that book's toes too much, but you get a decent sense of kind of the creative process that goes into at least developing like the concept art and the pre-production stuff around these movies.
Oh wow, that book doesn't even come out until
October.
Ugh. And it's not a Rinsler book; it's a Mark.
Yeah, and I'm a little wary
Oz.
of that book, or skeptical of it, because obviously Abrams is around and probably willing to do interviews, and all the other people who made it, and so I wonder how much of it is going to be not self-congratulatory, but those Rinsler books, you got kind of an unvarnished look at what was happening in Lucas's life, and how he made those films. And so I don't know how much of those, whatever edges were present in making Episode 7, I wonder how much those edges will be softened to make it seem like, yeah, this was a great experience. Everyone had a wonderful time. And then they brought this movie to you.
Exactly. I mean, as far as this book, this Art of the Force Awakens by Phil Sostak.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if you're a fan out there and you're looking like, I want to get something, I want to, I want to get, this is probably your best bet right now. Yeah. I would actually call this more essential than say, and we didn't put this on the thing, and I don't really want to get into it too deep, is the Alan Dean Foster's novelization that I only got a little bit into it and stopped, just because I actually kind of want to go see the movie one more time before I get into the novelization.
Yeah.
It's, for some reason, it's like, I was like, and I did the dumb thing, because I was like, I have all these Audible accounts. So I got the audiobook, and I do not, I forget the guy's voice. He's the guy's name that does the voices. The way his Poe Dameron is just shameful.
Yeah.
It just,
I've heard the writing itself, like the dialogue and the writing is not.
There's nothing to it. They basically say, except for a couple small bits and pieces, that it's actually a pretty inessential tie-in book.
Yeah.
But so it's like your money is better spent on this art book, because at least you get like some ideas about, some ideas where they thought they were going to go and how they change. It's just some, even if they aren't actually in the movie, they're just wonderful visuals. I mean, it's funny. I was flipping through this. I was at a used book, Half Price Books, and they had one of those, the illustrated Star Wars universe. Because I always wanted one of these definitive Ralph McQuarrie books. I'm always looking for a Ralph McQuarrie book. I think there's one coming out in a few months, and it's like $250. It's a 3-volume thing where it's like, I love that kind of book, but it's hard to spend that much on books, especially since you actually kind of almost want to have a table to put them on or something, because the binding of books now are so thin. But in passing, it was like they'd show a planet with a McQuarrie drawing, and then Kevin J. Anderson would write the story. And this is the book. Well, you know, the those kind of elongated, rounded, rectangular, I don't know what, they almost look like gas station things that were in on Jakku, where Rey was. I for some reason it never occurred to me that was a Ralph McQuarrie concept. And that, you know, the Falcon, in their escape from Jakku, they knock one over, or knock the only one over. And I'm just like, it felt very Star Wars when I saw it, and I didn't realize, like, oh, this is like leftovers from like 1976, some of these concepts.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think that's great. And I also think that as the movies go on, that McQuarrie's stuff will be less and less.
Yeah, I mean, as much as I love the McQuarrie stuff, and, you know, I think, you know, even stuff like that gate that they put into Episode 7 and on Jakku that, you know, is inspired by a McQuarrie painting, like, yeah, it still fits in the universe, right? And there's still a way to, like, put that McQuarrie stuff from 40 years ago and make it seem new. Yeah, I'd kind of like to see other things, right? I want to see. Yeah, I read a thing today just before the show about Rebels, and, you know, they were kind of making a similar point about, you know, they wanted to see they wanted to see Dave Filoni's idea of what Star Wars should look like, not Ralph McQuarrie's. And so, yeah, I mean, I kind of wonder at what point the people who make Star Wars bragging about, like, hey, we're referencing Ralph McQuarrie stuff. Like, I wonder at what point that kind of loses its cachet and people go like, yeah, that's great. Why don't we see what you have for us? And I think, I mean, honestly, I think there are some artists who work on Star Wars that are able to integrate the McQuarrie stuff with their own kind of view. You know, like, I think Doug Chiang does a really good job of you know, referencing McQuarrie enough to where it still feels like, you know, that old Star Wars feeling, but then integrating his own style into that. But then also just his painting just capture those same feelings of, you know, motion or movement or, you know, action, whatever the scene that he's painting is supposed to convey, right? Capturing the feeling of it, in addition to, you know, just the technical, like, oh, wait, he made a ship that, you know, sort of is interesting. So I think like I said, some of the artwork in this book, you know, is maybe a little too Predator-y, or this was clearly inspired by, like, decades worth of dark video games and whatever else that just doesn't really fit with a Star Wars movie.
Well, it's more of the kind of stuff that you would expect to see on the cover of one of those Old Republic books, you know, like the Darth Bane and the Revan and all that kind of stuff. It's very, you know, it's the concepts of, you know. I mean,
it's almost like the, you know, Marvel or the comics from the 90s and 2000s, where you're like, I'm gonna make a Sith Lord. I'm going to make them as muscular and as tall and evil as possible.
Even my pecs have pecs. That kind of, like, yeah.
And it's like, meh.
That's not.
We've moved away from that a long time ago. Like, not just in Star Wars, but in general.
And I think, and I did read a couple pages into it, and I think that a lot of that stems from that they basically said, go wild. Just go wild. Just do all the things. I mean, even back to that podcast interview, there was I think it was somebody from the art department or somebody had just said, what, you know, they were throwing out ideas about, you know, what did you always want to see in a Star Wars movie? It's like, I always wanted to see a lightsaber battle in a snowy climate. In a snowy forest. Yeah. And like, you know, somebody keyed off of that, and that's what these kind of, you get all your ideas out there, and some are good and some are bad. Some are fine, but not for this. And then it's like, well, you know, we don't want this muscular guy, or, you know, there's a thing about Luke Skywalker, like, sinking into sand at one point. And that's like these kind of things, like, well, they were never going to come up with a use for this, but, you know, maybe later on they'll have somebody will be sinking into sand. I mean, they're not not going to throw out a good idea, and you got to get these ideas. I like the idea that it's unrestricted when they're in the creation part, because it'd be way better. Because I think everybody knows that, like, well, these concepts aren't going to get used. This is too much like Frank Frazetta or
right.
Right. I just think I love to see how you'd think that maybe that artists would be worried about presenting this kind of this high concept looking stuff, and that they're all right with it. They're not going to use it, but they're not going to punish people for trying to be creative. And I think in the future, I was like, I'm really looking forward to new ships, new concepts. It's like this idea that, like, oh, we have to have, X-Wings have to look like, X-Wings, and it's like, no. I mean,
and they did. I mean, and I wouldn't say it's disappointing, but I do wish, like I said, that they had used some of those concepts that were more different. Even if it's still recognizable as a TIE fighter, but the silhouette is different, or someone came up with, okay, we need a new resistance fighter. Right, so we've done the X-Wing and the A-Wing and the Y-Wing and B, so come up with different ships, right? So they sketched what those might look like. And I appreciate those. And yeah, like having an X-Wing, but where the wings split in a slightly different way, it's like, yeah, that's different. But I mean, and this gets back to Lucas's comments too, and we discussed these already, so I don't know to. But yeah, like in some ways I do kind of want to see. Right. Oh, great. So 30 years later, they're just still using X-Wings, huh? Like, what else you got? Because some of those newer designs that did end up in Episode 7 were some of my favorite in the movie. So, yeah. So hopefully Episode 8 and 9 we get more of those. Rogue One, that's another area where I'm a little nervous because it's sort of locked into this particular time period where we have certain expectations. Again, going back to audience expectations, right? We have certain expectations of what these ships all look like, right? It's going to look similar to what the ships looked like in Episode 4.
Yeah, I don't think you're going to see a lot.
So they can't stray too far from that. And then it's like, okay, great. So we're not. What is the art department's job on this movie then? Is it to like add a fin and they take the Corellian Corvette and they just add a spoiler to it? We're like, well, then by the time they get to Episode 4, they've taken the spoiler off, and that's how they, make it now. It's like, well, okay, we'll see. So that's the other area where I'm a little like, well, I'm kind of curious to see how they do this more than I am excited.
Exactly. So I think we're kind of running near the end here. So
yeah,
probably should maybe table the soundtrack for another.
Yeah. And that's fine. And other folks have found insights in the soundtrack and
yeah, I mean, I definitely think it's worth going and checking out. The Rebel Force Radio. What's it called again?
Star Wars Oxygen. Yeah, they're doing it.
I don't agree with everything that he's saying, but he's also much more music theory adept than I could ever be.
Yeah. And for me, as someone who does have a little background in music theory, although it's been a dozen years at this point. I mean, in terms of theory, he's finding some interesting connections. I think for this soundtrack, they could dig in a little more even. And I think there's some stuff there, some connections that maybe I'm hearing and maybe they aren't real, but I think there are probably more connections in the soundtrack that are still to be explored and people will find over the next several years. So.
Yes. Anyway, so should we talk about this Vader Down comic?
Yeah, so let's move over to the comic. So in recent comics news and views, they wrapped up the Vader Down crossover, and then they're starting up some new mini series. So Vader Down first.
Good old fashioned Marvel style crossover.
Yeah, so the Darth Vader and the Star Wars comics crossed over. Darth Vader got caught behind enemy lines. He was on this planet where the rebellion was, I almost said practicing, but I guess running through drills, preparing themselves. And so he basically takes out like half the rebellion by himself. And then all of our heroes are there on the planet trying to catch him, and he's trying to catch them. And etc. So, what did you think of Vader Down?
I thought it started out interesting, and then this was 6 issues,
yeah,
and so by the time it was a mess at the end.
Yeah,
I found it was just, part of me is like, oh, why can't it be more like the fun of the 70s comic?
Mm-hmm.
And then part of me is like, yeah, this is just ridiculous. It's the,
Yeah.
and I'm jumping around, but there's like, what's the name of the guy that was the Mon Calamari guy with the General Grievous body?
Oh, yeah, I don't even remember his name.
And it was like, did I just miss him from something else?
Yeah, right. The last time you saw him was like 8 issues ago.
Okay.
Of the Star Wars comic.
It's the dumbest thing I've ever seen,
yeah.
and
he's one of those, right? So for you and for our listeners, so in the Star Wars comic, or I guess it's I don't even remember. I think it's the Darth Vader comic actually. Right. One of the early storylines was that the Emperor contracted out to some guy to essentially build him new apprentices, and so they all like use red lightsabers, but none of them are actually strong in the Force at all. And so he's just like using them as like his henchmen, as maybe, the next evolution of what Darth Vader is or whatever. And so you have, this guy who has a Mon Caliber body and then, cybernetic limbs. You have these 2 twins, a woman and a man. You have a lady who wears these goggles and has all these remotes that help her see and do things. Just kind of like weird in that would make more sense in like a more traditional Marvel superhero series, but in Star Wars, it's a little like, that's a little odd. Is that where we're taking this? So one of those people finally comes back in this crossover to get the best of Darth Vader, to both kill Darth Vader and capture Luke Skywalker, the thing that Darth Vader wanted to do, to like prove that he was superior to Darth Vader. And it kind of comes out of nowhere.
Yeah, I guess I understand. It's like comics. It's it's a visual medium. It's not a no offense to anybody out there who writes comics, but it's not really a writer's medium. It's not.
Right.
The storytelling is told through the visual, and a lot of it is luck and things that happen. Just kind of like, she's got the gun on Darth Vader. Oh, but something happens. She has to go take care, so she runs off, and it just like. And it feels artificially stretched out.
Yeah.
It honestly does kind of read like, like they did that thing. And I'm not super well versed in it, but I've seen it partly in a comic form and partly in a animated form. They did this thing called Planet Hulk, where they, the Bruce Banner's Hulk, whatever, became so unruly that they sent him to another planet where he fought as a gladiator. And it's almost kind of like, it reminds me of what I've read of Planet Hulk, and it's just it's just not the fact that they if they had said like, well, this if they were just like, well, the comics are the comics and the movies are the movies and the books are the books, I'd been fine. But this idea that now they're like, oh, get the whole story, it's, to me, it's like, I don't want this stuff to be part of the whole story. It's ridiculous, and
exactly, like it just feels odd.
Yeah, and just all these goofy, gimmicky things that they've done in the last year with, I don't know, maybe it's because it's geared for kids, but that's such a cop out, because I think kids are can be very sophisticated or can accept very sophisticated storytelling. So if they're just making it goofy, like a gladiator planet kind of thing, and obviously Vader is he's overpowered when he needs to be overpowered, and he's vulnerable when he needs to be vulnerable for the story. Yeah. And there doesn't seem to make any rhyme or reason. Like, like there's 300 guys, let's get him, and then they're all dead. And it's kind of, and it's like,
all right.
And this whole thing, like, and we're operating in this weird kind of, this post original trilogy, post prequel, post episode 7 understanding of the universe they're creating. And then people are like, they do everything in an opening crawl, and it's like, they have to actually like remind you, Luke doesn't know that he's Darth Vader's son. And it's just like,
right.
Well,
yeah.
I mean, there's a book called the Untold History of Marvel Comics, and one of the things that they criticized Marvel heavily is the kind of like the I can't even think of the appropriate, like kind of a sleazy way of storytelling, and instead of your kid with their pocket money going in and getting their comics every month, it's like now you have to buy X-Men 275, you have to get Fantastic Four 325, you have to get the Beyond or Limited thing to get the whole story, and that's totally what this is. I mean, I had to sit down and like read, in like, which issue do I read next? There's a checklist in the back, and there's something about it that was like, and the art style was in some certain issues I thought was just terrible.
And this is something that I think is true of all of their different series, like especially the faces of their characters, especially the faces of the known characters, right? The movie characters. It's really erratic. Like sometimes it looked like, wow, that really looks like Carrie Fisher. And other times, right, like I couldn't even begin to tell you who that is.
Right. It's just such a, it's just a missed opportunity. If you could tell such a fun story in these comics, and I just think a lot of it, maybe it's, I've always had this kind of weird relationship with comic books. It's like, I don't know if I actually have ever truly been a comic book guy, except for like 2 years in 8th and 9th grade when I was like, all my money I had went to comic books, and then I kind of just got burned out on them. And my initial interest in comics was definitely a Star Wars thing, because I would always buy. That was the only thing. I never bought Superman. I didn't buy Batman. I bought Star Wars. So I'm very kind of. I just think that they would serve the reader better if they just did more short, like 22-page stories, like one-offs. Like, Luke. Or Han goes back to Tatooine to pick up something he left behind, and runs afoul of somebody, and it's told in 22 pages. But what I think is a lot of it's big splash page, a little bit of action, and then last page revelation, and then I'm like, hey, buy this one. It's like, I feel like they're literally just trying to get $4 out of you at this point.
Yeah, and now, so they had the next one-off Obi-Wan issue of the Star Wars comic came out today. So I'm willing to give it a little more time and see what the next storyline is in the Star Wars comic, kind of where they go from here. But I feel like now I'm mostly reading them out of obligation so that I can talk about them here more than like, wow, I'm really enjoying this story and I'm really engaged and I want to see what happens next. It's sort of like, I'm kind of curious to see what they're doing with this story, but I don't really, like, I'm not really that interested in it. I'm just sort of like, oh, I want to know because I'm more interested in seeing like what they're doing with it, not what it is, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah,
and we really don't have time to get into it. But I mean, my whole thing is like, I'd be more excited about an episodic or a continuous story in Rebels, and then one-offs in the comics. And of course we're different timelines, different characters. It's like one of the criticisms I had about the things I didn't like about the first half of the season of Rebels is that it felt like a lot more like everything was just a one-off.
Right. Well, and they were essentially setting things up for the second half of the season.
Right. And I think
we're doing these one-offs to introduce new characters, and now they're actually going to do something with those characters.
Yeah, and I'm pretty excited about that. That trailer is good, and the Princess Leia thing will be interesting. I don't know. I'm not going to predict whether it's going to be good, bad, or indifferent. It's kind of like, okay, well, now this thing is really getting into
Right. They were kind of moving in this direction almost from the I guess, the second episode of the show.
Right.
But so now it's here. So now we get to see. All right, you've been building to this for a while, so now we can judge it. Okay, so that was a Vader crossover comic. I guess a couple weeks ago, the first issue of the Obi-Wan and Anakin miniseries came out. It looks decent. I want to wait another issue or two before I talk about it, just because I want to kind of see what happens first.
When is it set?
So Anakin is probably 10 or 12. So he's a preteen, I think. He might. Well, so how old is he in episode 2?
He's supposed to be 20.
Okay, yeah. So this is a good ways before that, right? So he's clearly still an apprentice, right? He's not at the point where like, oh wow, he could be his own Jedi Knight now. He's still clearly an apprentice to Obi-Wan, but he's also been with Obi-Wan for several years now, and so they have more of an understanding and more of a rapport. It's not at the point where Obi-Wan's still trying to figure out who this kid is that Qui-Gon stuck him with,
Yeah, well, I mean, it should be good. I mean, I'll give it a try. I mean, I like the idea that they haven't completely junked the prequel era, which, like I said, there's so many fans are coming back into the fold after what it feels like probably a 15-year hiatus. Mm-hmm. Any kind of anything that smacks of the prequels, probably like they're afraid it might turn them off. But right. I think that if people that this is a thing that they're like, it's like you can determine your own involvement, mm-hmm. your own level of involvement in Star Wars. It's like, if you're like, I just want to watch the movies, that's great because those are great movies. And it's like, but if you want to go, if you're kind of like getting back into that, there are some fun stories from that. There are some fun stories that can be, well, I guess since a lot of that has been jettisoned for a new continuity, but even so, there's no rule that says you can't go back and read those books,
Yeah, right. And yeah, so I think that's one thing interesting too is, I'm not the biggest fan of the Clone Wars show.
No.
But it is sort of interesting to now see, okay, well, here's a slightly different take on this time period where Anakin is an apprentice and, he and Obi-Wan are kind of working together to do stuff. So that's sort of, I will say that there are dirigibles in this, or dirigibles in this series. So, I wouldn't go so far as to call it steampunk yet.
Oh,
but that's kind of why I want to wait a couple more issues before I talk about it, because I want to see where that goes.
Oh, man, my dislike of steampunk only seems to increase
I know.
As the years go on.
Too.
Have you seen that? Have you seen there's like a game show where it's people making steampunk?
Oh,
my wife watches it. It's literally, I don't even understand how she can be in the room with me when it's going on, because it's literally me stalking the front room going, look at this crap. What a bunch of, these are people, they make a living off of this crap.
So I was talking to someone else who lives here recently, and we were talking about how much it's changed in Austin, Texas, I mean. And we were talking about how much it's changed in the last couple of years. And I started complaining, and he was like, oh, have you seen that steampunk bar that they put up?
Oh.
And I was like, yes. And I started complaining about it. He was complaining about it too. And then we realized that we were talking about different steampunk bars.
Oh.
That there are 2 steampunk bars in Austin now. At least 2. So and once I found that out, I got even madder. I was like, are you telling me there's another one? And it,
Yeah,
so.
you're T-minus 6 months from seeing a t-shirt that says keep Austin geared.
Oh.
like a leather vest that says keep Austin geared.
Yeah. And the G is a gear, and the loop of the D is a gear, and the
So I think we're probably
so the other comics news recently is that Poe Dameron is getting his own miniseries.
Oh yes.
Let's talk about that real quick. So Poe Dameron is only, I assume it's going to be a miniseries. I guess they could make it like Kanan and say like, oh, it's really popular and everyone loves Poe Dameron, so let's keep it going. But I assume it'll only be 5 issues. So Charles Soule is going to be the writer. He was the writer for the Princess Leia miniseries. He's also the writer for this Obi-Wan and Anakin series. Phil Noto is doing the art. He did the artwork for the Chewbacca miniseries, as well as some of the young adult books that came out in the Star Wars : Journey to the Force Awakens. So Poe Dameron's getting his own comic now, which is neat. Do you have any thoughts about that?
I mean, that's the thing. It's like he was so underdeveloped in the movie, and they're probably it's gonna be one of those things where it's gonna be more of a halting depiction because they're probably trying to avoid all these problems they had in the last era with the expanded universe never seeming to match up with the movies very well. Like something would be said, then it would be, which I honestly feel like they shouldn't worry so much about, but they seem to be overly concerned about that kind of stuff. I mean, I was not as into Shattered Empire as some people were. So, you know, if this is pre or, I mean, you know, it probably will be pre episode 7.
Yeah.
I get this feeling. It's like, yeah, you know, maybe.
It's just a mission that he, you know, cause he's General Leia's most trusted pilot. So, you know, here's a mission where he starts to gain that trust, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, maybe with him and BB-8 doing something. Or, so, I mean, I'll give it a shot. I mean, there's a one-off. I guess there's a one-off in. I think it's not actually even coming out until March. A one-off where you find out what the deal with C-3PO's arm.
Oh, right, that's right.
His red arm that was like, you know, the
who cares?
Who really cares?
I mean, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah,
he had his arms ripped off in the Vader Down crossover,
which I thought was hilarious. I mean,
he's lost arms in the movie. Like he just loses arms sometimes. I don't know.
I came to I know we're tight on time, but I have one revelation that I'd like to bring up and then give our audience something to think about. Or they're not going to sit around thinking about what I think. Mm-hmm. I'm not a huge C-3PO fan.
Yeah,
never have been.
Yeah,
it's not my favorite. He's kind of like. He's actually getting progressively annoying as the movies go on. So I'm kind of like, hey man, you know, if you need to kill somebody off in episode 8,
kind of gradually like reduce his character down to just like, oh, he's the annoying one.
Yeah. He topped out my interest. My interest in him topped out in Empire.
Yeah,
I thought he had some really funny stuff going
on.
He
was fine in Return of the Jedi. He was fine. He had his moments.
Yeah, I guess so.
But so real quick, right, all these people getting their own miniseries, all these characters. Who would you like to see get their own kind of comic miniseries, Robert?
Let's see here. I'm trying to think. It's like who? I
have some ideas if you need.
Okay, you go first then.
So I think Mace Windu would be a really good choice.
That's a good one. Yeah,
you know, because the comics are getting more diverse and should be, right? And so here's a chance to sort of showcase that within Star Wars. You know, they've already, as you know, stepped back into the prequel era with the Obi-Wan and Anakin comics. So, you know, it could be Mace Windu either as a Jedi Knight or as a Jedi Master, whatever. But, you know, just kind of doing stuff and being cool and being a Jedi. You know, that's a character that, again, doesn't really get explored that much in the movies. The Shatterpoint novel I thought was pretty good.
Yes, that was one of the better.
It's pretty intense.
Yeah.
But it's pretty good, and so, you know, it doesn't even have to be that intense or violent. You know, just Mace Windu doing stuff. Another idea I had was Sabine, right? Because she, again, doesn't get a lot of play on Rebels. And so, you know, a comic with a female lead and a young female lead. You know, either her life in the Imperial Academy, I think, could be interesting, or on Rebels in the first half of the season, we learned that she was a bounty hunter for a little bit, so maybe something like that could work. And then the other option I had was Laura Santeca, Just because, as we mentioned a couple times in the show, there's such an implied history and backstory to that character, just based on his dialogue and his conversation with Poe, that, all right, well, maybe it's time to start filling that in and answering those. And I think, the comics would be maybe potentially, depending on what that backstory is, but the comics would potentially be a better way to start exploring that than, waiting for someone to write a novel about, the Lore Santeca duology or whatever.
Yeah, exactly.
So
Yeah,
those were the ideas I had.
I guess I always think about, although it might, if they're still actually working on a Boba Fett movie, which I don't actually see them say that they're doing this. They just keep talking about it. I feel like Boba Fett's character post Attack of the Clones was kind of a mess. I didn't like his depiction in Clone Wars. I know they did some young adult novels, but I'm not really interested in that. I do like this idea that if they're going to stick with the idea that with the continuity of it being this unaltered clone of Jango Fett, maybe some teenage or early 20s version of him pre-Empire kind of stuff. Definitely would go. I would read a Maz Kanata miniseries from 900 years ago where she could, be hanging out with Yoda or something, or hanging out with the Wookiees, since she seems to like Wookiees. And probably the one I'd be the most excited about would be a Captain Phasma, because obviously she's criminally underused in the movie. I'm pretty sure
you could showcase her chrome uniform a lot better in the comics than you would in like a novel.
Exactly.
And
so the whole idea of although some people are saying that there's there's going to be more to that story in the movies, but I don't believe that. I think she's going to be kind of I think she might end up being like kind of the Boba Fett in the way that they'll be like, wait a second, this is the mystery.
This is how they got rid of Boba Fett.
So, I mean, that would be my three ideas for that. Yeah. But I think we're about ready to wrap up here. Yep. I will say, just on a non-Star Warsian kind of thing, if you're one of the few people that listen to this show that don't know us in real life, there was a article on the Kernel or the Daily Dot. I don't really know. It's
Kernel is in like kernel of corn.
With a K, yeah. Kernel
is in kernel. I was trying to think of a Star Wars kernel and I couldn't.
Yeah, I guess the website is the Daily Dot, and then the kernel is a sub part of it. I've never read this before.
Yeah.
This website before. Yeah, it's a subset of the Daily Dot. So it's kernelmag.dailydot.com. And then on the week of January 17th, there was an article called An Oral History of a Special Thing, the World's Most Important Comedy Message Board by Rick Paulus. And that is something near and dear to our hearts.
It's how we met.
It's how we met. We were a part of that. We're not mentioned directly in the article. We were not interviewed, but
at least in my case, I feel I don't think I should have been mentioned either. I wasn't.
No, and I definitely am not grousing about. I honestly feel I appear in the article because our friend Heather mentions being married in a specialthing.com, which was a comedy message board at the time. She get married in a shirt, and I performed the wedding. So therefore I'm part of this article. In my own stretch. But anyway, it was an alternative comedy message board, and there's really no way I could explain it any better than Rick does in a 8,000 word article. It's a oral history. Basically, some of our best friends in the world are interviewed in it, and it's a great read. And it's a thing that has since passed into infamy and probably will never come again. Yeah. But it's worth checking out. Yep. Also, we'd love to hear from you. We've had a lot of personal.
We've had some time off
to take care of, traveling and disruptions in our houses and work and stuff. So we haven't been able to do a lot, but hopefully we're going to be back on a more normal schedule. You can obviously, we're on Twitter at talkingbirdcast. We are on
Tumblr at Talking Bird Star Wars, and with Rebels coming back, I'll probably end up posting more there.
Yeah, it's talkingbirdstarswars.tumblr.com.
Mm-hmm.
Talkingbirdcast@gmail.com.
Yeah, send us questions, comments, anything you vehemently disagree with us about.
Yeah,
although I don't know why you would. I mean, we're pretty right now,
pretty much stuff. on the money,
on the spot.
So, I think we'll be here next week. All intents purposes, we're planning on it. So we'll end there, and because we got tons more to talk about. It feels like there's new stuff every day, and we haven't even, like I said, scratched the surface of like the music, and I'd like to go. Like I said, I keep wanting to go to the Cinerama, the Paul Allen owned deluxe theater downtown Seattle. Every time I go, the center row, which is where I want to sit, has been sold out for 2 weeks. I want to go see it one more time in the theater, but so wish me luck. For Talking Birdcast, I have been Robert Zachary,
and I am still John Llewellyn.
Thanks for listening, and may the Force be with you.